The morning air in London carried a crisp bite that made 8-year-old Lily pull her purple jacket tighter around her small frame. She walked slowly beside her grandmother, matching the older woman's careful pace as they made their way down the wide sidewalk toward Buckingham Palace. Grandma Rose leaned heavily on her silver walking cane, pausing every few steps to catch her breath. "Are we almost there, Grandma?" Lily asked, looking up at the woman who had been her whole world for the past 2 years. Rose smiled down at her granddaughter, though Lily could see the tiredness in her eyes. "Just around this corner, sweetheart. Just around this corner." They had traveled down from Liverpool the night before, staying in a small hotel near Victoria Station. Rose had saved up for months for this trip, even though the doctors had told her to rest more and travel less. But this wasn't just any trip. This was something Rose had dreamed about since she was Lily's age, growing up in a tiny flat above her father's shoe repair shop. As they turned the corner, the magnificent gates of Buckingham Palace came into view. Lily gasped at the sight. The black iron gates stood tall and imposing, decorated with gold details that caught the morning sunlight. Beyond the gates, the palace itself stretched out like something from a fairy tale, all cream-colored stone and tall windows. "Wow," Lily whispered, unconsciously reaching for her grandmother's free hand. Rose squeezed her granddaughter's fingers gently. "Beautiful, isn't it? I've wanted to see this place my whole life." The area around the palace was already busy with tourists, even though it was still early morning. People from all over the world gathered along the gates, taking photos and chatting excitedly in different languages. Tour guides held up colorful umbrellas and flags, leading groups of visitors who listened carefully to stories about the royal family. Lily and Rose found a spot near the center of the gates where they could see clearly. The little girl pressed her face against the cool metal bars, trying to get the best view possible. That's when she first noticed the guards. They stood perfectly still, like statues come to life. Each guard wore a bright red jacket with shiny gold buttons, black pants with a sharp crease down the front, and the most amazing hat Lily had ever seen. The tall black furry hats made the guards look even taller than they already were. "Grandma, why don't they move?" Lily asked, fascinated by how still the guards could stand. "They're protecting the Queen," Rose explained, her voice soft with respect. "They're some of the best soldiers in the world, and it's a great honor to guard the royal family." Rose had always been interested in military history. She had grown up hearing stories from her own father, who had served in World War II. Though Rose herself had never been in the military, she had always admired the dedication and sacrifice of those who served their country. She had taught Lily to respect soldiers and understand the important job they did. As they watched, more tourists gathered around them. A family from Japan took turns posing for photos in front of the gates. A group of teenagers from Germany laughed as they tried to get the guards to smile or move. An elderly couple from Australia stood quietly, holding hands as they admired the scene. But Lily found herself focusing on one guard in particular. He stood about 20 feet away from where she and her grandmother were positioned. Unlike some of the other guards who seemed to look straight ahead into the distance, this guard's eyes seemed more alert, more aware of what was happening around him. Lily couldn't explain it, but she felt like he was different somehow. Maybe it was the way he held himself or the way his eyes occasionally moved to scan the crowd. While the other guards seemed like they were looking through the people, this guard seemed to be looking at them. "That guard over there," Lily said, pointing discreetly. "He seems different." Rose followed her granddaughter's gaze and observed the guard for a moment. "You're very observant, sweetheart. He does seem more present than the others." What neither Lily nor Rose knew was that guard David Thompson was indeed different from his fellow guards in several important ways. At 26 years old, he had already served 2 tours overseas and had been specially trained in crowd observation and threat assessment. His role wasn't just to stand and look impressive. He was actively watching for any signs of trouble or distress among the crowds. David had noticed the little girl and her grandmother almost as soon as they arrived. Something about them had caught his attention immediately. Maybe it was the way the elderly woman moved so carefully, or the way the little girl stayed so close to her side. Maybe it was the look of wonder mixed with sadness that he could see in both their faces. In his years of service, David had developed an instinct for reading people. He could usually tell the difference between tourists who were just excited to be there and those who had deeper, more personal reasons for visiting. The grandmother and granddaughter definitely fell into the second category. As the morning progressed, more people arrived to watch the guards. The crowd grew thicker, and Lily found herself struggling to see over the adults who stood in front of them. Rose, already tired from the walk, began to look even more pale and drawn. "Do you want to sit down, Grandma?" Lily asked, noticing how her grandmother was gripping her cane more tightly. "I'm fine, dear," Rose replied, though her voice sounded weaker than it had earlier. "I just want to watch for a little while longer." Lily looked around and saw a bench about 50 feet away, but it was already occupied by other tired tourists. She felt frustrated that there wasn't a better place for her grandmother to rest and still see the guards. That's when she noticed that Guard Thompson was looking directly at them. Not just in their general direction, but specifically at them. For a moment, their eyes met through the iron bars of the gate. Lily felt a strange sense of connection with the guard. It was as if he understood that they weren't just regular tourists taking photos and moving on. Something in his expression seemed kind, even though his face remained professionally neutral. Rose noticed the interaction between her granddaughter and the guard. "He's watching us," she whispered to Lily. "I think he can tell that you're tired," Lily whispered back. "Smart girl," Rose said with a weak smile. "You always notice things that other people miss." This was true. Even at 8 years, old Lily had always been exceptionally observant. She could tell when her teacher was having a bad day before anyone else noticed. She could sense when other kids at school were sad or worried, even when they tried to hide it. And she could definitely tell that her grandmother was sicker than she let on. The truth was that Rose was dying. The doctors had told them that she had maybe 3 months left, possibly less. But Rose hadn't wanted to spend those months sitting in hospitals or lying in bed at home. She had a list of things she wanted to do and see, and visiting Buckingham Palace had been at the top of that list for as long as anyone could remember. Lily knew her grandmother was very sick, though Rose tried to protect her from the worst details. But Lily wasn't stupid. She could see how much weight Rose had lost, how tired she got from simple activities, and how many pills she had to take every day. That's why this trip was so important to both of them. It wasn't just a fun vacation. It was a chance to make one last beautiful memory together. As they continued to watch the guards, Lily found herself studying Guard Thompson more carefully. There was something about his demeanor that made her think he might understand their situation better than the other guards would. She couldn't explain why she felt this way, but the feeling was strong. "Grandma," Lily said quietly, "do you think that guard knows sign language?" Rose looked surprised by the question. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" "I don't know. Just something about the way he's watching us. Like he's trying to understand something." Rose had taught Lily sign language over the past year, during the long hours they spent together in hospital waiting rooms and at home during Rose's treatment days. It had started as a way to pass time, but it had become something special between them, a private way to communicate when Rose's throat was too sore from treatment to speak comfortably. "Even if he does know sign language," Rose said gently, "we shouldn't bother him, he's working." But Lily continued to watch Guard Thompson, and he continued to watch them back. There was definitely something happening between them, some kind of silent communication that neither of them fully understood yet. The crowd around them continued to grow, and the noise level increased as more tour groups arrived. Children laughed and pointed at the guards, while adults took countless photos and videos. Street performers set up nearby, adding music and entertainment to the busy scene. Through it all, Guard Thompson remained focused on his duties, but Lily noticed that his attention kept returning to her and her grandmother. It was subtle, just a slight shift of his eyes or a barely perceptible turn of his head, but it was definitely there. "I think he's worried about you, Grandma," Lily said. Rose looked over at the guard again and had to admit that her granddaughter might be right. There was something in the soldier's posture that suggested concern, even though he maintained his Professional composure. He seems like a good man, Rose said softly. The moment guard David Thompson saw the little girl's hands move in those familiar patterns, his world shifted. For just a split second, his professional composure wavered as memories flooded back. His younger brother Jake, born deaf, teaching him his first signs when David was barely 10 years old. Years of family dinners conducted in a mixture of spoken words and flowing hand movements. The pride in his parents' eyes when David became fluent enough to interpret for Jake at school events. Lily had signed a simple but powerful message. Help. Grandma sick. Please. David's training told him to maintain his position, to ignore the interaction, to focus on his duties as a Queen's Guard. But his heart told him something entirely different. He could see the desperation in the little girl's eyes, the way she protectively stayed close to her grandmother's side, the obvious struggle the elderly woman was having just to remain standing. Very carefully, so subtly that only someone looking directly at him would notice, David gave the smallest possible nod. It was barely a movement at all, just a slight dip of his chin that lasted less than a second. But it was enough. Lily's face lit up with hope. She had been right. The guard did understand sign language, and more importantly, he had acknowledged her plea for help. Grandma, Lily whispered, tugging gently on Rose's coat sleeve. He knows sign language. He understood me. Rose looked confused for a moment, then realized what her granddaughter had done. Lily, what did you sign to him? I told him you were sick and asked for help, Lily replied honestly. Rose felt a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. She didn't want to be seen as weak or needy, but she also appreciated her granddaughter's protective instincts. Oh, sweetheart, you didn't need to do that. Yes, I did, Lily said firmly. You've been looking forward to this for so long, and you're getting too tired to enjoy it properly. Guard Thompson continued to watch them while maintaining his official duties. He could see that the little girl was explaining something to her grandmother, and he could tell that the older woman was becoming emotional. The situation was clearly more complex than just a tourist wanting a better view. Over the years, David had learned to read people quickly and accurately. It was part of his job to assess potential threats, but it had also made him sensitive to people in genuine distress. The grandmother wasn't just tired from walking around London, she was seriously ill. The way she held herself, the pallor of her skin, the careful way she breathed. These were all signs David recognized from visiting his own grandfather during his final illness. The crowd around the palace gates continued to grow thicker and noisier. More tour groups arrived, and street vendors began setting up nearby to sell souvenirs and snacks to the tourists. The noise level increased as people chatted excitedly in dozens of different languages, all eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. In the midst of all this chaos, Lily found herself feeling increasingly protective of her grandmother. Rose was being jostled by other tourists who were pushing forward to get better positions, and she was clearly struggling to maintain her balance. Lily looked back at Guard Thompson and signed another message. She served country too. Nurse. This additional information hit David like a physical blow. The elderly woman wasn't just a tourist, she was a veteran of some kind, someone who had served her country just as he was serving his. This changed everything in his mind. His respect for military service and veterans ran deep, instilled in him by his own family's history of service and reinforced by his own experiences overseas. David's grandfather had served in Korea, his father in the Falklands, and now David himself was carrying on the family tradition. The idea that a fellow veteran was struggling just a few feet away from him, while he stood bound by protocol, created a conflict between his duty as a guard and his personal values. Very carefully, David signed back to Lily. What kind of nurse? Lily's eyes widened with excitement when she saw the guard's hands move. She quickly translated for her grandmother. Grandma, he's asking what kind of nurse you were. Rose was amazed. In all her years, she had never expected to have a conversation in sign language with a Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. Tell him I was a military nurse, she whispered to Lily. I served in field hospitals. Lily's hands moved quickly as she relayed this information. David's expression, though still professionally neutral, somehow conveyed deep respect. He signed back, "Thank you for your service." When Lily translated this message, Rose began to cry quietly. It had been years since anyone had thanked her for her military service. Most people didn't even know that she had served, and fewer still understood what military nurses had gone through during their deployments. "Tell him it was an honor," Rose whispered through her tears. As this silent conversation continued, other tourists remained completely unaware of what was happening. To them, the guard was simply standing at his post as usual, and the grandmother and granddaughter were just two more faces in the crowd. They had no idea that a profound human connection was being forged through hand signals and shared understanding. David found himself thinking about his own motivations for joining the military and eventually becoming one of the Queen's Guards. It wasn't just about the prestige or the tradition, it was about service, about protecting and honoring the values that people like Rose had fought to defend. He looked at Rose again, seeing her not just as a tourist but as a fellow service member who deserved respect and recognition. The protocol that prevented him from breaking rank suddenly seemed less important than the human being who stood before him. Lily, emboldened by the guards' responses, decided to share more of their story. She signed, "This her dream. Always wanted to see guards. She very sick now." David felt his heart break a little at this message. The full weight of the situation became clear to him. This wasn't just a casual tourist visit. This was likely a final wish, a last chance for the elderly veteran to experience something she had dreamed about her entire life. He thought about his own grandmother, who had passed away the previous year. She had also had a list of things she wanted to do before she died, and David's family had worked hard to help her accomplish as many of them as possible. He understood the importance of these final experiences, these last opportunities, to create meaningful memories. The guard's next sign surprised even himself. "How can I help?" When Lily translated this message, Rose gasped audibly. "He wants to help us?" "That's what he signed," Lily confirmed, hardly believing it herself. Rose looked directly at Guard Thompson for the first time since their silent conversation had begun. Even from a distance, she could see the kindness in his eyes, the genuine concern in his expression. This young soldier was willing to risk getting in trouble just to help a stranger fulfill her dream. "Tell him," Rose said slowly, "that just acknowledging us like this is more than enough. Tell him that this conversation has already made this the most special day of my life." Lily's hands moved carefully as she conveyed her grandmother's message. David felt a lump form in his throat as he read the words. But he also felt a growing determination. This brave woman who had served her country deserved more than just acknowledgement. She deserved to have her dream fully realized. He began to think about what he could actually do within the constraints of his position. Moving from his post was absolutely forbidden, but there might be other ways to make this experience special for Rose and Lily. The other guards in his unit were good men, David knew. They had all taken the same oath, shared the same values, and understood the importance of honoring those who had served before them. Maybe if he could somehow communicate the situation to them, they might be willing to help in small ways. David signed to Lily. "Tell other guards?" Lily looked confused by this message and asked her grandmother what it might mean. "I think he's asking if he can tell the other guards about us," Rose said thoughtfully. "Should I tell him yes?" Lily asked. Rose considered this carefully. Part of her didn't want to cause any trouble for these young soldiers, but another part of her was deeply touched by their willingness to help. "Tell him yes, but only if it won't get anyone in trouble." Lily signed this response, and David nodded almost imperceptibly. He had an idea forming, something that might be possible without breaking the most serious rules of protocol. During the brief moments when the crowds were looking elsewhere or taking photos of other parts of the palace, David managed to catch the attention of the guard stationed next to him. Using the minimal hand signals that guards use to communicate with each other during their duties, he conveyed that there was a veteran in the crowd who deserved special recognition. The second Guard Corporal James Wilson understood immediately. He had served in Afghanistan alongside David and shared his respect for military service. Without breaking his own position, James managed to pass the message along to the next guard in line. Within minutes, word had spread among several of the guards about the elderly military nurse who was visiting the palace. Each guard had his own way of acknowledging this information, a slightly straighter posture, a more attentive gaze, a subtle sense of increased pride in their service. Lily noticed that more of the guards seemed to be paying attention to them now. "Grandma, I think he told the other guards about you." The distant sound of military drums grew louder as the ceremonial band approached Buckingham Palace. Guard David Thompson felt his heart rate increase, not from the excitement of the ceremony he had performed dozens of times before, but from the weight of the decision he was contemplating. Everything in his military training screamed against what he was considering, but everything in his heart told him it was the right thing to do. Standing perfectly still in his red tunic and towering bearskin hat, David appeared to the hundreds of gathering tourists as just another motionless sentinel, but inside a fierce battle raged between duty and compassion, between following orders and following his conscience. The changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace was one of the most watched military traditions in the world. Millions of people had witnessed it over the decades, and it was performed with clockwork precision every time. The guards' movements were choreographed down to the smallest detail, their timing practiced until it became second nature. Any deviation from the established routine would be noticed immediately by superior officers, fellow guards, and the crowd of spectators. David glanced toward his commanding officer, Captain Richardson, who stood watching from a position near the palace entrance. The captain's job was to ensure that every aspect of the ceremony went according to protocol. Richardson was a good officer, fair but strict, and he had made it clear to all his guards that maintaining the dignity and precision of the ceremony was paramount. Next to David, Corporal Wilson stood equally still, but David could sense the tension in his fellow guard's posture. Wilson had received David's discreet signal about the veteran in the crowd, and David knew that his colleague was struggling with the same conflict between protocol and human decency. Lily continued to stand, pressed against the palace gates, her small hands wrapped around the iron bars as she watched David with hopeful eyes. Her grandmother Rose leaned heavily against the fence beside her, using it for support as her strength continued to fade. The morning's excitement and standing for so long had taken a visible toll on the elderly woman. "How much longer until it starts, Grandma?" Lily asked quietly, noticing how pale her grandmother had become. "Soon, sweetheart," Rose replied, though her voice was weak. "Very soon." Rose could feel herself getting worse by the minute. The combination of her illness, the travel, and the emotional intensity of the morning was overwhelming her system. She wanted desperately to see the ceremony that she had dreamed about for so long, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could remain standing. David noticed Rose's deteriorating condition and felt his resolve strengthen. This woman had served her country with honor, and now she was fighting just to stand upright long enough to witness a military tradition that clearly meant the world to her. If he didn't act soon, she might not be able to enjoy the ceremony at all. The sound of the approaching band grew even louder, and the crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch. People pushed forward against the gates trying to secure the best possible viewing positions. Several times other tourists bumped into Rose, nearly causing her to lose her balance. Lily became increasingly agitated as she watched people jostle. Her grandmother. "Excuse me," she said firmly to a large man who had stepped directly in front of Rose, blocking her view. "My grandmother was here first." The man ignored her completely, focused only on getting his camera in position for the ceremony. David watched this interaction with growing anger. Here was a military veteran being pushed around by thoughtless tourists who had no idea what this moment meant to her. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was supposed to be protecting and honoring what the palace represented, yet he was standing by while someone who had actually served that same cause was being disrespected. Captain Richardson's voice could be heard giving final instructions to the incoming guard unit. The ceremony would begin in just a few minutes. David knew that once it started, There would be no opportunity for him to help Rose and Lily. It was now or never. The internal debate that had been raging in David's mind suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. Yes, he might face disciplinary action for breaking protocol. Yes, he might even lose his position as a Queen's Guard. But some things were more important than following rules blindly. Some moments demanded that a person choose between being a perfect soldier and being a decent human being. David thought about his own military service, about the veterans who had served before him, about the oaths he had taken not just to follow orders, but to protect and serve with honor. Surely honoring a fellow veteran fell within that sacred duty, even if it meant bending the rules. He looked at Rose again, seeing the determination in her face despite her obvious pain. This woman had probably saved lives during her military service. She had probably comforted wounded soldiers, worked in dangerous conditions, and sacrificed her own comfort for the sake of others. Now she was asking for nothing more than the chance to witness a military tradition before her time ran out. The decision suddenly became easy. David began to move. It started so subtly that most people didn't notice at first. Just a slight shift in his weight, a barely perceptible step away from his assigned position. But to the other guards and to Captain Richardson, who were trained to notice such things, it was immediately obvious that something unprecedented was happening. Corporal Wilson, standing next to David, felt his heart skip a beat as he realized what his fellow guard was doing. Part of him wanted to signal David to stop, to return to position before anyone in authority noticed, but another part of him admired his colleague's courage and wanted to support him. The tourists closest to David's position began to murmur as they noticed the guard moving. This was completely unexpected. Everyone knew that the Queen's Guards were famous for their ability to stand motionless for hours, regardless of weather or distractions. "Look," whispered a woman standing near Lily and Rose. "That guard is moving." "They're not supposed to do that, are they?" her husband replied, raising his camera to record what might be a unique moment. David took another step, then another. Each movement felt monumental, like he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. But with each step toward the gates where Lily and Rose waited, his confidence grew stronger. Captain Richardson noticed the movement immediately and felt a surge of alarm. In his 15 years of overseeing palace ceremonies, he had never seen a guard break ranks during an active duty period. His first instinct was to intervene immediately, to order David back to his position before the situation could escalate. But something made the captain pause. Richardson was a student of military history and tradition, and he understood that sometimes the most important military decisions were made by individual soldiers who chose to act on their conscience rather than simply follow orders. Some of the most honored moments in military history had come from soldiers who broke protocol to do what they believed was right. Still, this was Buckingham Palace, not a battlefield. The rules here existed for important reasons, and allowing guards to break ranks whenever they felt like it would undermine the entire ceremonial system. Richardson began walking toward David's position, intending to stop whatever was happening before it went too far. But as he got closer, he could see what had captured David's attention. The elderly woman leaning against the fence was clearly in distress, and the little girl beside her was watching David with an expression of desperate hope. David continued his slow, deliberate approach toward the gates. With each step, more tourists noticed what was happening. Some began taking photos and videos, sensing that they were witnessing something unusual and possibly historic. "Is he coming over here?" Lily asked her grandmother, hardly daring to believe. "And I think he is, sweetheart," Rose replied, feeling a mixture of gratitude and concern. "But I hope he doesn't get in trouble for helping us." David could hear Captain Richardson's footsteps approaching from behind, but he didn't stop. He was committed now, whatever the consequences might be. As he got closer to the gates, he could see Rose's condition more clearly, and it only strengthened his resolve. This woman was obviously very ill, and this might be her last chance to experience something that meant so much to her. When David reached the gate where Lily and Rose were standing, the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. Guards simply didn't do this. In all the years that tourists had visited Buckingham Palace, The Queen's guards had maintained their positions with unwavering discipline. David looked down at Lily and signed a simple message. For your grandmother. Then, in a gesture that would be recorded by dozens of cameras and remembered by hundreds of witnesses, Guard David Thompson began to remove his bearskin hat. The crowd gasped collectively as they realized what was happening. The guard was not only breaking protocol by approaching the gates, but he was removing part of his official uniform. This was absolutely unprecedented. Captain Richardson froze in his tracks, torn between his duty to maintain order and his growing understanding that something extraordinary was taking place. The other guards watched in amazement as their colleague did something that none of them had ever imagined possible. David held his bearskin hat carefully in both hands and extended it toward. Rose held the magnificent bearskin hat against her chest, feeling its surprising weight and the softness of the black fur. Through her tears, she could see the young guard standing before her, his face serious but kind, his eyes reflecting the same emotion she felt in her heart. In all her years of military service and all her dreams of visiting this place, she had never imagined anything like this moment. It's beautiful, she whispered, running her weathered fingers along the hat's surface. I've never held anything so special. Guard David Thompson watched her reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and growing concern. He could hear Captain Richardson's footsteps behind him, and he knew that he was about to face consequences for his actions. But seeing the joy and wonder in Rose's eyes made it all worthwhile. Lily stood beside her grandmother, barely able to believe what was happening. The guard had actually done it. He had broken all the rules to give her grandmother this incredible experience. She wanted to hug him, to thank him properly, but the iron gate stood between them. How heavy is it? Lily asked, fascinated by the hat that seemed so large in her grandmother's small hands. Heavier than you might think, David replied, with a slight smile. We wear these for hours at a time during ceremonies. They're made to last for decades. The crowd around them had grown completely silent, with hundreds of tourists watching the unprecedented scene unfold. Many had their phones and cameras out, recording what they instinctively knew was a historic moment. Even the most cynical observers seemed moved by the obvious emotion of the elderly woman holding the guard's hat. A young mother standing nearby wiped tears from her own eyes as she watched Rose's reaction. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, she whispered to her husband. I can't believe he's actually doing this, her husband replied, filming the interaction on his phone. Guards aren't supposed to move, let alone give their equipment to tourists. But this wasn't just any tourist, and David wasn't just breaking rules for the sake of it. This was about honoring someone who had served her country, about recognizing sacrifice, about choosing compassion over rigid adherence to protocol. Captain Richardson finally approached close enough to intervene. He could see that the situation was completely outside normal procedures, but he could also see that it was motivated by genuine respect and kindness, rather than any desire to disrupt or cause trouble. Thompson, the captain said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone who was in charge. What exactly is happening here? David turned to face his commanding officer, still maintaining his respectful military bearing, despite having completely abandoned his assigned position. Sir, this lady is a veteran. She served as a military nurse, and she's always dreamed of seeing the changing of the guard ceremony. She's very ill, sir, and I wanted to honor her service. Richardson looked at Rose, taking in her obvious frailty and the reverent way she held the bearskin hat. He had served long enough to recognize a fellow veteran when he saw one, and he could see that David's assessment was accurate. And you thought the appropriate way to honor her was to abandon your post and give her your hat? Richardson asked, though his tone was more curious than angry. Sir, I thought the appropriate way to honor her was to show her the respect that one veteran deserves from another, David replied firmly. Sometimes following the spirit of our duty is more important than following the letter of our orders. This response surprised Richardson. It was articulate, thoughtful, and showed a level of moral reasoning that the captain respected, even if he couldn't officially condone the breach of protocol. Rose, overhearing this conversation, tried to hand the hat back to David. Please, she said, her voice shaking. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me. Just being able to hold it for a moment was more than enough. Keep it for now, David said gently. The ceremony is about to begin, and you should be able to watch it properly. Captain Richardson found himself in an impossible position. According to regulations, he should immediately order David back to his post and confiscate the hat. But he was also aware that hundreds of tourists were watching, many of them recording the interaction. How would it look if he forcibly separated a dying veteran from a simple act of kindness? More importantly, Richardson was beginning to understand that this moment represented something larger than just one guard's decision to break protocol. This was about the values that the Queen's Guard was supposed to represent: honor, service, and dedication to something greater than oneself. The sound of the approaching ceremonial band was now very close, and Richardson knew he had to make a decision quickly. The changing of the guard ceremony would begin in just a few minutes, and he needed to have his guards in their proper positions. Thompson, he said finally, return to your post. We'll discuss this after the ceremony. David nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. But before he moved, he turned back to Rose and said, Ma'am, it would be my honor if you would keep that hat during the ceremony. You can return it afterward if you'd like, but right now, I want you to hold a piece of the tradition you came to see. Rose looked at Captain Richardson, uncertain whether she was allowed to accept this incredible gift even temporarily. The captain studied her face for a moment, seeing the hope and gratitude there. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Ma'am, Richardson said formally, on behalf of Her Majesty's Guard, we thank you for your service to our country. Please consider that hat our way of ensuring you have the best possible view of today's ceremony. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, moved by the captain's decision to support his guard's act of kindness rather than punish it. Even tourists, who didn't fully understand the significance of what was happening, could sense that they were witnessing something special. David felt a surge of gratitude toward his commanding officer. Richardson could have handled the situation very differently, and David had been prepared to accept whatever consequences came from his actions. Instead, the captain had chosen to honor the spirit of what David was trying to do. Thank you, sir, David said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Richardson replied with a slight smile. We still need to talk about proper procedures, but right now we have a ceremony to perform. As David began walking back toward his assigned position, he stopped for a moment next to Corporal Wilson, who had been watching the entire interaction, with amazement. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish, Wilson whispered. Maybe both, David admitted. But it was the right thing to do. Wilson nodded slowly. He had served alongside David long enough to respect his judgment, and he had to admit that he probably would have done the same thing in David's position. The other guards in the unit had all witnessed what happened, and David could see a mixture of admiration and concern in their faces as he returned to his post. What he had done was unprecedented, but it was also undeniably courageous. As David resumed his position, the ceremonial band finally came into view, their red uniforms bright in the morning sunlight, their instruments gleaming as they played, the traditional marching music that announced the beginning of the changing of the guard ceremony. Rose, still holding the bearskin hat carefully in her arms, felt overwhelmed by the kindness she had been shown. This was already so much more than she had ever hoped for when she had dreamed of visiting Buckingham Palace. "Grandma, how do you feel?" Lily asked, noticing that her grandmother seemed more energized than she had all morning. "I feel like the luckiest person in the world," Rose replied, her eyes shining with joy. "This young man has given me something I'll treasure for the rest of my life." The ceremony began with the traditional precision that had made it famous around the world. The guards moved in perfect synchronization, their red tunics and black pants immaculate, their movements sharp and coordinated. The crowd watched in fascination as the old guard was formally relieved by the new guard, with commands shouted in the crisp British military style that had remained unchanged for generations. But for many of the tourists watching that day, the most memorable part of the ceremony had already happened. The spontaneous act of kindness between David and Rose had shown them something that no amount of pageantry could demonstrate: the human heart that beat beneath the military tradition. As the ceremony progressed, David maintained his professional composure, but he couldn't help glancing occasionally toward the spot where Rose and Lily stood. The elderly woman was watching every moment of the ceremony with intense concentration, clearly savoring every detail of the experience she had waited a lifetime to witness. Other tourists near Rose began to understand what had happened, and word spread through the crowd about the veteran who was being honored by the guards. People began making space around Rose and Lily, ensuring that they had an unobstructed view of the ceremony. Several people offered Rose a chair or asked if she needed anything, moved by the obvious significance of the moment for her. "This is incredible," Rose whispered to Lily as the guards performed their intricate movements. "I never imagined it would be so beautiful, so precise." "It's like a dance," Lily observed, watching the guards' coordinated steps. David Thompson approached the palace gates where Rose and Lily waited, no longer bound by the rigid posture required of an on-duty Queen's Guard. Captain Richardson walked beside him, and David couldn't quite read his commanding officer's expression. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Rose still clutched the bearskin hat against her chest, treating it like the precious artifact it was. She had spent the entire ceremony memorizing every detail of its construction, from the individual strands of black fur to the gleaming metal plate at its front. She knew she would have to give it back, but she wanted to remember everything about this incredible experience. "Sir," Rose said to Captain Richardson as the two soldiers approached, "I want you to know that your guard did nothing wrong. I never asked him to break any rules, and if anyone should be in trouble, it should be me for distracting him from his duties." Richardson smiled at Rose's attempt to protect David. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't think you could have distracted Thompson from anything if he hadn't wanted to be distracted. He made his choice freely, and he'll face the consequences like the soldier he is." David felt his stomach tighten. The captain's words could be interpreted as either supportive or ominous, and David still wasn't sure which way the situation was going to go. "However," Richardson continued, "before we discuss consequences, I'd like to hear more about your military service if you're willing to share." Rose looked surprised by the request, but she was happy to talk about her time in the military. It wasn't often that anyone asked about her service, and she was proud of what she had accomplished. "I served as a field nurse for 8 years," she began, her voice growing stronger as she talked about something that had defined much of her life. "I was deployed to 3 different conflict zones, mostly working in mobile field hospitals. We treated everyone, our own soldiers, allies, even enemy combatants when they were brought to us. That must have been incredibly difficult work," Richardson said with genuine respect. "It was," Rose admitted. "But it was also the most meaningful work I've ever done. When you're treating a wounded soldier, you're not thinking about politics or strategy or anything else. You're just trying to save a life to send someone home to their family." David listened to Rose's story with growing admiration. He had served in combat zones himself, and he knew how dangerous and emotionally challenging it was for medical personnel who had to treat the casualties of war. "The thing that always struck me," Rose continued, "was how young most of the soldiers were. Boys really, barely older than teenagers, dealing with situations that would challenge much older, more experienced people. It made me want to protect them, to give them whatever comfort I could while they healed." Lily, who had heard some of these stories before, watched her grandmother with pride. Even at 8 years old, she understood that her grandmother had done something important and brave during her military service. "Ma'am," Richardson said formally, speaking as both an officer and as someone who has served in similar situations, "I want to thank you for your service. Medical personnel in combat zones often don't get the recognition they deserve, but their work is absolutely crucial." Rose felt tears forming in her eyes again. "Thank you, Captain. That means more to me than you can know." Richardson turned to David and his expression became more serious. "Thompson, what you did today was completely outside normal protocol. You abandoned your post, you engaged with civilians during an active ceremony, and you removed part of your official uniform to give to a member of the public." David stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever punishment was coming. "Yes, sir. I understand that my actions were outside normal procedures. However, Richardson continued, I've been thinking about the oath we all took when we became Queen's Guards. We swore to serve with honor, to protect and defend, and to uphold the values that this uniform represents. Today, you demonstrated those values in a way that went beyond following orders. David felt a flicker of hope, but he remained cautiously optimistic. The Queen's Guard exists to protect and honor the monarchy and what it represents, Richardson explained. But ultimately, the monarchy represents the people of this country, including veterans like Mrs. Rose here who served with distinction. By honoring her service, you were honoring the very values we're supposed to protect. Rose gasped softly, hardly believing what she was hearing. That being said, Richardson continued, we can't have guards abandoning their posts whenever they feel like it, no matter how noble their intentions. So here's what's going to happen. David braced himself for the consequences. You're going to be reassigned to a new position within the Palace Guard, Richardson announced. Effective immediately, you'll be working with our community outreach program, specifically focusing on veterans affairs. Your job will be to help coordinate visits and events for military veterans who want to experience the palace and its traditions. David's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't punishment. This was an opportunity to do more of what he had done today, but in an official capacity. Sir, are you serious? David asked, hardly daring to believe it. Completely serious, Richardson replied. What you demonstrated today was initiative, compassion, and a deep understanding of what our service is really about. Those are exactly the qualities we need in someone working with veterans. Rose began crying openly, overwhelmed by the kindness and understanding these soldiers were showing. And Mrs. Rose, Richardson continued, we'd like you to be our first official participant in this new program. That hat you're holding? Consider it a permanent loan from Her Majesty's Guard with our compliments. Lily jumped up and down with excitement. Grandma, you get to keep it. You actually get to keep the hat. Rose couldn't speak through her tears. She had come to London expecting nothing more than a chance to watch the changing of the Guard from a distance. Instead, she was leaving with a piece of military history and the knowledge that her service had been recognized and honored in the most meaningful way possible. There's one more thing, Richardson said with a smile. This story is going to get out. There are already videos of what happened today circulating on social media. Rather than trying to suppress it, we're going to embrace it. We want people to know that the Queen's Guard isn't just about ceremony and tradition. We're about honoring service and showing respect for those who have served before us. Over the following days, the story of Rose Lilly and Guard David Thompson spread far beyond London. Videos of the moment when David handed his bearskin hat to Rose were shared millions of times across social media platforms. News organizations around the world picked up the story, presenting it as an example of humanity triumphing over rigid bureaucracy. But the real impact of that day went far beyond viral videos and news coverage. Rose lived for another 2 months after her visit to Buckingham Palace, and they were among the happiest months of her life. She kept the bearskin hat on a special stand in her living room, and she would often sit beside it in the evenings, telling Lily stories about her military service and about the kind young guard who had honored her in such an unexpected way. When Rose passed away peacefully in her sleep on a quiet Tuesday morning, Lily made sure that the bearskin hat was displayed prominently at her funeral. Many of Rose's old military colleagues attended the service, and several of them commented that it was fitting that Rose's final adventure had involved being honored by fellow service members. David Thompson thrived in his new role working with veterans. The position allowed him to use his military experience and his natural empathy to help other veterans connect with the traditions and history of the Queen's Guard. He organized special viewing areas for disabled veterans during ceremonies, arranged private tours of the palace for families of fallen soldiers, and created programs that helped young veterans understand their place in the long tradition of British military service. Captain Richardson was promoted 6 months later, partly based on his handling of the Rose situation. His superiors recognized that his decision to support David's actions rather than punish them had generated more positive publicity for the Queen's Guard than any official marketing campaign could have achieved. The story also had an unexpected, Impact on other members of the military around the world. Soldiers in other countries began sharing their own stories of times when they had chosen compassion over strict adherence to rules, creating a broader conversation about the balance between military discipline and human decency. Lily, now a teenager, still corresponds regularly with David Thompson. They exchange letters and emails, and David has become something like an older brother to her. She's expressed interest in joining the military herself when she's old enough, inspired by both her grandmother's service and David's example of what it means to serve with honor. The bearskin hat that started it all still sits in Lily's room, now carefully preserved in a climate-controlled case that David helped her obtain. Sometimes when she's having a difficult day or facing a challenging decision, Lily sits beside the hat and thinks about her grandmother's courage and the guard who risked his career to honor a dying veteran's dream. David often speaks at military academies and training programs, telling the story of his encounter with Rose and Lily.